Good morning. Today is our last day of our virtual pilgrimage in Israel, so I decided to dress up a little bit. Or it could be that I'm filming on Thursday afternoon after coming home from filming the worship service at the church. You'll have to decide. But today we visit two sites that are in some ways competing sites for the actual place where Jesus was crucified and the actual tomb where he was raised from the dead. And like so many things in Israel, it's hard to know. First one is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and we briefly touched on that yesterday. This is a very large building right in the middle of now what is the old city of Jerusalem, even though in the time of Jesus it would have been outside the city walls. And that's significant because we know that Jesus was crucified outside of the city walls. Astounding to me is how close the traditional site of the crucifixion and the site of the now empty tomb are within just a stone's throw, within the same building. The site of the crucifixion is up some stairs. It is still on what would be the side of a hill, although it's inside of the building. When you go there, there's an altar over the site, rumored to be, or the legend says, was where Jesus was crucified, and you can actually crawl under the altar and put your hand into the hole where they say the cross actually stood. And when I did that, even though that's a rather strange thing to do, it was an interesting time and a powerful moment for me. Coming down, you pass by this large stone in the floor that is said to be the traditional site where Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus prepared Jesus' body before burying it in the tomb, which is just a few yards away from there. And as I mentioned yesterday, the tomb is inside and a little kind of chapel inside the church. The tomb is called, that little building is called the Edicule. And that site has been used as a site for Christian worship since fairly soon after Jesus' resurrection. We know that the Emperor Hadrian, Caesar, one of the rulers of Rome, trying to put down the Christian movement, had that tomb filled in and built over the top of it a temple to the goddess Venus. And he was trying to stamp out Christianity and erase from memory that empty tomb. And in a sense, he preserved it by putting a temple there, by making a big deal out of it. The site may have been preserved. We didn't lose where it was. At a later date, after Constantine allowed Christianity to flourish in the Roman Empire, a church was built there. In the early 600s, when the Muslims came in and they took over Jerusalem, they decided to leave it as a holy site for Christians. And they forbade Muslims from praying there because they did not want anyone to believe that they were trying to turn this holy Christian site into a mosque. By the early 1000s, however, the relationship between Christians and Muslims had soured very much, and one of the Muslim rulers had the church destroyed and the tomb largely destroyed as well. After the time of the Crusades, when the ownership, I guess you would say, of Jerusalem went back and forth, eventually a church was built there again, and it has been there to this day. Ever since that time. And so you go into the church and you are there in that spot where the resurrection of Jesus may well have taken place. There's an interesting tradition that on Easter Sunday, people take torches that are unlit into the edicule, into the tomb, and that they are spontaneously ignited by the joy of the angels perhaps, or even maybe the worshipers who are there in the tomb. And they bring the torches back out spontaneously ignited, and they hand the torches off to other people, and there are other torches, people out with other torches, and all around the edicule the light shines and grows. And it's a kind of neat tradition. I kind of wonder whether it actually happens spontaneously, but it's a neat tradition nonetheless. Then there is, at a different part of town, another site that could possibly be the site of both the crucifixion and the resurrection. It's sometimes called Gordon's Calvary or just the Garden Tomb. And it is still outdoors, and it is right next to a hill that looks somewhat like a skull, and so some believe that that might be Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified. And then this tomb, which is an ancient tomb, actually going back to probably 700 or 800 years before Christ, is there in the side of the hill. Now we know that according to the Gospels, Jesus was buried in a tomb that had never been used before, and the ancient nature of that tomb makes it less likely that it is actually the tomb. And yet many pilgrims, myself included, like Gordon's Calvary because it is outdoors, and so you get a little bit of feel for what it might have felt like to see the crucifixion there at Golgotha, and then for the burial there in the tomb. Interestingly, the place of the skull there, Golgotha, looks over what is today a bus parking lot where city buses come and go all day long. It's very highly trafficked, and that's very appropriate because in those days when Jesus was crucified, he would have been crucified on a major thoroughfare so that all who passed by would see the way that Rome handled people who did not follow Roman law or who in one way or another offended Roman sensibilities. When I was there at the Garden Tomb, at one point another pastor and I stepped into the tomb, and you are allowed to do that. And we were standing there, and while we were in there, somebody shut the wooden door behind us because on the door it says, "He is not here, he is risen," and they wanted to take a picture of that plaque on the door. But we are there in the tomb, and all of a sudden the door shuts behind us, and we kind of teased and said, "Well, gee, I sure hope they don't leave us in here for 3 days." But let's think just a little bit about the fact that we have two sites that are competing to be the sites and what we're going to do with that and what that means for us theologically. Recently I heard someone say that faith, or the opposite of faith rather, is not doubt, but the opposite of faith is certainty. And think about that for a moment. We certainly want to have a few certainties about our faith. We want to have our faith based on some bedrock certainties. And yet, think about all of the terrible things that have been done in the name of God by people who were certain they were doing God's will, by reacting in violence or retribution or revenge, all of the things I already mentioned, the Crusades and that kind of things, where people decided that God wanted us to have Jerusalem and the more Muslims we killed, the better, this kind of thing. Oftentimes, certainty is that which destroys faith. Faith needs, almost by definition, a bit of faith. We have to trust that although we cannot prove which site is the site of Jesus' resurrection any more than we can prove the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we trust it, we take it as a measure of faith, and it informs and takes and changes our lives. On this day, I want to encourage you not to have doubt, even though it's fine to have a little bit of doubt, but even more not to worry so much with certainty, but trust that even when I am doubting, the certainty of God's love is still with me. God still loves me, whether I can experience that love or not. And let us marvel at the fact that for nearly 2,000 years now, pilgrims have gone to Israel, that they might walk where Jesus walked. They might encounter the places where he was, and encounter him in a new way. And that experience culminates with coming to an empty tomb. And whether the tomb is inside a church, inside the city walls of Jerusalem, or inside the side of a hill outside the old city, we know that that empty tomb does not mean that Jesus is gone, but it means that he is risen. And that empty tomb means that we can celebrate that God is with us.